Let me say this clearly, right from the top. If a therapy model leaves people traumatized, silenced, or shamed, even decades later, then it doesn't matter how well-intentioned it was. It doesn't matter if the practitioner had credentials. It doesn't matter if the data says they made progress. If autistic people are saying they were harmed, that harm is real, and it needs to be taken seriously. Intentions don't erase impact. And yet, the moment we try to talk about that impact, we're met with an exhausting cycle of defensiveness. We name what happened to us, and instead of being believed, we're met with corrections, reframes, excuses. In the case of applied behavioral analysis, many of us are told that must have been a bad provider. ABA doesn't do that anymore. You just don't understand the science. We don't do punishment-based methods now. That wasn't real ABA. As if our stories are PR problems. As if trauma only counts if it meets someone else's standard of what trauma should look like. And these deflections often come from credentialed professionals who, instead of listening, rush to protect the reputation of the work they do. But if autistic adults are consistently describing harm, and those descriptions echo across countries, generations, and providers, then what more will it take for people to start listening? Hi, I'm Essie. I'm an autistic and ADHD therapist, and I'm not here to argue over labels. I'm not here to wage a war on science or deny that some people feel helped by behavior-based approaches. What I am here to do is name a pattern I constantly see in this work, a deep resistance from neurotypical systems to hear, believe, and act on the lived experiences of neurodivergent people. This resistance isn't just about one field. It's not just about ABA. It's not even just about therapy. It's a window into how power functions when the people who have been harmed by a system are told that their harm doesn't count. It's about who gets to be the expert, who gets to define progress, who gets to decide what stories are worth listening to, and which ones are too inconvenient to take seriously. And it's about how that gatekeeping shows up every time autistic people speak in a way that challenges the version of the world that neurotypical professionals have built their careers on. Let's ground this in something real. In a recent exchange online, an ABA practitioner insisted that the concerns about abuse in behavior therapy were outdated. According to them, modern ABA is completely different. It's now assent-based, trauma-informed, and based on improving quality of life. Any lingering distrust, they said, was due to bad apples or misunderstanding. Maybe uncredentialed providers, maybe confused clients, certainly not the method itself. But when a recent study highlighted autistic adults describing trauma provided by credentialed providers, the practitioner didn't engage with what was said. Instead, they shifted focus to whether those accounts could be trusted at all. Were they really receiving ABA? Do they know what ABA is? Maybe they were mislabeling what happened. Maybe they didn't understand the principles. Maybe they're just bitter, or misinformed, or exaggerating. But when a neurotypical professional hears somebody neurodivergent say, "This hurts me," and their first response is to audit the survivor's memory instead of their own field, we're not talking about reform. We're talking about reputation management. And it reveals something deeper, that our stories as neurodivergents are only welcomed when they fit into the narrative professionals already believe, when they confirm that the system is safe, that progress is happening, that harm was in the past. The moment we say otherwise, we stop being collaborators and start becoming threats. The subtext here is loud and painfully familiar. If your story doesn't align with our model, then your story must be wrong. If it doesn't fit within the data, the diagnostic codes, the framework we're trained to trust, then it must be you who's misunderstood, not the method, not the goal, not the field. And this isn't a debate about research design. It's not a scientific disagreement over how to improve care. It's something more fundamental, a refusal to believe neurodivergent people when we describe our own lives, a refusal to accept that harm can happen even under best practices, a refusal to entertain the idea that maybe the goal of some interventions, normalization, compliance, and yes, erasure, is the problem. And above all, a refusal to treat lived experience as a legitimate form of evidence. Because if they let themselves accept it, if they really let themselves hear it, then they'd have to ask hard questions about their field, their role, and what they were trained to see as help. And most systems would rather defend their structure than face what they break. And that refusal to believe us is part of something bigger, a kind of structural gaslighting that shows up everywhere neurodivergent people try to speak about our own lives. It's what philosophers call epistemic injustice, but more specifically, epistemic gatekeeping, when only certain types of knowledge are considered trustworthy, and those types usually come from institutions, professionals, or credentialed experts, not from people with lived experience. And in neurodivergent spaces, that gatekeeping is everywhere. It shows up when studies led by neurotypicals are treated as more rigorous, even when those studies deliberately exclude autistic perspectives. It shows up when lived experience is automatically labeled as biased or anecdotal, while professional interpretations are treated as neutral, even though they're shaped by their own training, values, and blind spots. It shows up when peer-reviewed studies documenting harm are waved away because their methods weren't flawless. And so the cycle continues. Neurodivergent voices are ignored for not sounding scientific and then discredited when we do sound scientific because we're seen as too angry, too online, too political, too emotionally invested. It's a rigged game where we are always too something to be believed. In the recent exchange I mentioned earlier, a credentialed ABA practitioner responded to a study regarding the traumatic impact of ABA on some autistic clients with what sounded like scientific scrutiny, but what functioned more like a strategy to disqualify autistic testimony altogether. Instead of engaging with the substance of the findings, he instead disputed them. At no point did he stop to ask, what if the harm being described is real? And this wasn't a one-off reaction. These kinds of criticisms can show up when autistic voices are centered in research about ABA, especially when that research describes harm. The data is self-reported, so it must be unreliable. The diagnoses weren't independently verified, so we can't be sure they were really autistic. Too many respondents identified as female or non-binary, so the sample is skewed. The survey questions weren't taken from clinical tools, so they're not rigorous. There's no control group. It doesn't prove causation. And while some of these points might be fair in a narrow academic context, they're often deployed not as a neutral critique, but as rhetorical shields. They're used to dismiss the entire body of testimony, to reassert that if harm happened, it must be anecdotal, misattributed, or exaggerated. And yes, methodological critique has a place. We want research to be robust. But here, the criticism functions as invalidation. It becomes a way to silence the core message, which is that people are describing deep, lasting psychological harm from experiences in ABA, many of them with credentialed practitioners following protocol. And the thing is, the study in question was never meant to be the final word. It was exploratory. It was one of the first steps toward formally measuring something autistic people had already been describing for years, that the experience of being in ABA, even modern ABA, could feel coercive, overwhelming, and dehumanizing. It tried to ask, what happens when a therapeutic model centers control over consent? What happens when compliance is prioritized over comfort? When the metric for success is how well you hide your autistic traits? And many of us already knew the answer because we lived it. Which brings us to this. We're not just talking about bad apples. We're talking about the structure of the field itself, a field shaped around compliance, around data sheets, around the assumption that autistic behavior needs correction. Even when the language shifts, the goals often stay the same. Make us easier to manage, less disruptive, easier to explain. And when that's the metric, lived experience becomes inconvenient. Because lived experience says, my stimming isn't necessarily a problem. My avoidance isn't defiance. My shutdown isn't manipulation. My resistance isn't a lack of insight. It might actually be a boundary. But in systems built on behaviorist logic, boundaries get recorded as noncompliance. But in systems built on behaviorist logic, boundaries get recoded as noncompliance. Noncompliance becomes pathology. Pathology demands intervention. So instead of asking why so many autistic people carry trauma from therapy, the field asks how to get us back on task. And when we speak up, we're painted as irrational, uninformed, mistaken about our own memories. But what if the reason it hurt is because we understood it exactly as it was? Because it wasn't made for our thriving. It was designed to manage us. And even now, with more polished branding, the same outcomes keep being rewarded. Mask more, push through, say yes, sit still, don't draw attention. And the fact that we have to defend our trauma with citations is part of what re-traumatizes us. And when an autistic adult says ABA harmed them, we're cross-examined like a hostile witness. Which brings us to a bigger point. The conversation about ABA is really a conversation about power. The moment autistic people push back on the systems that harmed us, we're expected to do so on neurotypical terms. We're asked for data, citations, and disclaimers. We're reminded to stay objective, even while talking about our own lives. But professionals defending the system often aren't held to the same standard. They're allowed to speculate, dismiss, and condescend without evidence. They can question our memory, our diagnosis, even our sanity, and still be seen as the voice of reason, because they're the experts. They're wearing the right badge, speaking the right language. They know how to play the game. And that's the double bind. If we get emotional, we're too reactive to be taken seriously. But if we stayed calm and articulate, we're told, you must not have been that traumatized. So there's no right way to speak our pain, no format that makes it sound. It's a form of epistemic injustice, the idea that your knowledge doesn't matter because of who you are, because of the body and mind you speak from. That's what autistic people are up against when we critique systems like ABA. We're challenging an entire hierarchy of whose truth is allowed to shape reality. And for many professionals, that's deeply uncomfortable, because it means letting go of control. It means realizing that compliance is not consent, and that trauma can still happen under a well-written protocol. It means listening to the people you once believed you were helping and hearing that you may have hurt them. That takes humility. It takes unlearning. And that's not something that behaviorist models are especially good at, because those models were never designed to ask the person being changed whether they wanted to be changed in the first place. And that's what this entire exchange reveals, a microcosm of something bigger, how neurotypical systems respond when neurodivergent people claim authority over our own experiences. Because the moment we say, this hurt me, the conversation shifts. Suddenly, it's not about us anymore. It becomes about the reputation of the field, about defending credentials, about maintaining professional control. We see this pattern again and again. A neurodivergent person shares a painful truth. A professional responds with doubt, reframing, or correction. And then somehow the person who shared their story ends up being the one who has to prove, explain, or justify their perspective. The power dynamic flips the script. The person with lived experience becomes the one on trial. The professional becomes the arbiter of what's real. And this is how systems maintain themselves, not through overt malice, but through constant micro-invalidations, through the reflex to defend practice over people, through the assumption that professionals are more trustworthy narrators of autistic lives than autistic people are. And it doesn't stop with ABA. You see it in schools, in psychiatry, in medical care, in media, anywhere where neurodivergent people speak truths that make neurotypicals feel uncomfortable. So when professionals say, we're just asking questions, what they often mean is, we're reserving the right to doubt you, no matter how many times your story gets told. And when they say, that's not representative, what they often mean is, you're making us look bad. But naming harm shouldn't be interpreted as an attack, but rather a demand for change. And if a field can't tolerate that demand, can't welcome it, examine it, grow from it, then it's not a therapeutic model. It's a power structure protecting itself. This is why the neurodiversity movement matters so much. It doesn't just ask for new methods, it asks for a new mindset. A mindset where autistic people aren't problems to be solved, but people to be understood. Where support isn't measured by how well we perform neurotypical behavior, but by how safe, empowered, and connected we feel in our own bodies. Where trauma isn't dismissed because it came from evidence-based practice. And where professionals don't ask, does this intervention work? But also, does this person want it, Does it affirm their humanity? Does it leave them more themselves, not less? That kind of mindset can't be grafted onto a compliance-based system. It has to be built with us, through listening, through co-design, through shared power. That's what so many of us are fighting for. Not the erasure of therapeutic support, but the end of therapeutic control disguised as care. We want practitioners who ask, not assume, who collaborate, not correct. We want safety, we want choice, we want to be believed. So if you're a practitioner and you're feeling defensive right now, I get it. It's hard to hear that something you trained in, something you believed in, something you did with care and good intent might have caused harm. But being trauma-informed isn't just about what methods you use, it's about how you respond when someone says, "That hurt me." Defensiveness isn't trauma-informed. Disbelief isn't trauma-informed. Shifting the conversation back to your expertise isn't trauma-informed. What is? Sitting with discomfort, staying curious, taking accountability without needing to be reassured, making space for the possibility that you missed something because the system you learned in was not designed to center people like us. And if you're a neurodivergent person watching this, know that you shouldn't need a diagnosis to be heard, you shouldn't need citations to be believed, you shouldn't have to explain why coercion, wrapped in good intentions, still leaves scars. You get to define what safety feels like, you get to say no. You get to speak your truth, even if it makes professionals uncomfortable. That discomfort isn't your failure, it's the system being asked to grow. And if the system wants to be truly therapeutic, it has to start by listening. Really listening. If you found this video helpful, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and share it with anyone you think might benefit from my content. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.